Hey everyone, this is Anshul Sadaria, software engineer at Google. In this module, I will be covering object-oriented programming concepts in C++. But before we dive into those concepts, don't forget to check out Scalar's free masterclasses taken by industry-leading experts only on Scalar's event page. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get started. Let me start with a flashback from the first module about C++. If you remember, I told you how C++ was born as a programming language, right? So let me just cover that part once again so that you have an idea why object-oriented programming is so important. Okay, so before C++ was conceptualized, it was known as C with classes, and that was the primary reason, the primary reason for C with classes to be conceptualized by that PhD professor or the person who was pursuing his PhD thesis was that he was working on a programming language Simula at that time, which was one of the most primary programming languages which had object-oriented programming paradigm, which was not there in C at that time, but C was fast. So that person thought of merging both the benefits into one programming language, and that's how C with classes was born. He tried to add the object-oriented programming paradigm into the C language, and hence it was known as C with classes, which was renamed to C++ later. So one of the main reasons of C++ to be born as a programming language was it had object-oriented programming paradigm with it. Now you might be confused, like he keeps on speaking object-oriented programming again and again. What does it actually mean? To throw you another technical definition, technical jargon, which you will surely understand when this module ends for sure. Okay, it means that you have the capability to define classes. Now what is classes? Classes are user-defined data type. For example, int is a predefined data type in C++. Classes, structs, all of these are user-defined data types. So you can define classes, create objects from them, and then you can have objects interact with each other. So I know all of these is still a technical jargon, but I am going to cover all of the dimensions about object-oriented programming in this module from the very beginning. So you use classes which are defined by the user, make objects out of it, and these objects are used to... Now, what does a class have? A class has data members. You can also find the analogy similar to what variables are. Data members, then the classes have member functions. And classes have something known as access modifiers. Apart from that, there are 4 axes of object-oriented programming concepts. Let me just get rid of the history lesson. Okay, so now there are 4 main pillars of object-oriented programming, and these are similar in all the languages if the language is object-oriented programming. Okay, it can be Java, it can be Python, whatever language is OOP compliant, object-oriented programming. Then it should have these 4 axes covered. The first one being encapsulation. The second one is abstraction. The third one being polymorphism. And lastly, we will have something known as inheritance. So these 6 components, class, object, encapsulation, abstraction, polymorphism, and inheritance. These are the 6 main things which can cover all the concepts of object-oriented programming paradigm. And other concepts are peripheral around it, like if I throw some technical jargon once again, then abstract classes and all of those are closely related to one of these concepts itself. Okay, so now let's get started. So I told you something about structs. Now what are structs? I didn't define it in the first 2 modules, and we are not going to cover it in detail in this module as well. But structs is a user-defined, first of all. What is struct? Struct is a user-defined data type. Now what does it do? It binds different data members within it, And what can be the data members? It can be structs itself, it can be integers, floats, boolean, it can be any other data type. So struct is kind of binding different types of data that we want in an entity. For example, person is an entity. Now what does the person have? They can have name, age, gender, occupation, and lots of other details included in it. So this is how, like, this is the syntax of struct first of all, and this is how you can define a struct and use it. For example, we had int a in one of our previous modules. This was the declaration of an integer. So similarly here, the data type of the structure is person. So you can have person p or any name you want to give it. Person is the data type over here, and this is user defined data type. Okay. And if you want to access any of the data members of a struct, what you can do is p.name is equal to, let's say, Anshul in this case, in my case, and so on. Like, you can change any data member inside it, you can access any data member inside it, you can just play around with it. Let's say it was for students, then you can store marks like English marks, mathematics marks, and so on. And this one data type will like encapsulate all the other data types which are relevant for that particular entity. Now you might be wondering why I'm talking about struct when I was supposed to talk about classes. Now taking it a notch higher, how classes are related to structs? Classes are also user defined data type. User defined data type. But instead of just data members, as I told earlier, it has three main entities. So classes will have data members, which is similar to struct itself. Like, they can be variables of different data types. It can be a struct inside, like the data member can be a struct, it can be integer, float, boolean, string, whatever we want to it. There can also be arrays. Okay, so any data type can be a part of classes. And I will usually use the term data members or variables interchangingly. So like, I am hoping you won't get confused throughout the duration of this module. Then next would be member functions. Now the main reason why classes are defined is to bind these data members with the member functions. These member functions have access to the data members. They can access them, they can tweak them, they can do any processing on top of them. Okay. So these I can like interchangeably use functions or methods or any other name for it. So till now, like in the first two modules, you were introduced to variables and functions. And you can continue with that analogy that data members are actually variables and member functions are actually functions. And lastly, access modifiers, which is going to be something new for this particular module, which we have not covered at all in the first two modules. Now, what are access modifiers? They control how you access these data members and member functions. Okay. So first of all, these data members can be accessed by any code outside the classes. It can also be accessed by the member functions, and it can also be accessed by the child classes. Now, child classes is some technical jargon I use which I have not explained, but I will be covering that in detail in inheritance concept. So just remember this thing, that access modifiers control how your entities inside a class can be accessed. Okay, so what are the different types of access modifiers? It can be public, which means anyone can access it. Anyone can call the function. Like, if a function is public inside a class, anyone can call that function. If a data member is public inside the class, then any function outside the class as well can access it. Then comes the protected modifier. Now this means that child classes can access those entities. It can be data members or member functions. Now again, I am telling you, we will cover child classes in detail in inheritance. So for the time being, ignore that there is something known as protected in the access modifiers. That will become more crucial as we approach the later half of this module. Now, last type of access modifier is private. Now private means not everyone can access those entities, only the member functions can access these entities which are defined inside the class. Okay, both data members and member functions can be private. And if a member function is private, it means that only the function inside the class can call that particular private member function. And if a data member is private inside the class, then only both private and non-private member functions inside the class can call it. But the restriction is anyone outside the class cannot call it. Okay. So we will talk about the code as well in a little moment. So when you see the code, you will realize what I actually meant. So right now, I hope the definitions are clear, like what are the different types of access modifiers, public, protected, and private, what's the major difference between public and private, and we'll also look into the code, what it actually means, and what are data members and member functions. To just give a real life analogy, for example, whenever I am cooking, I usually refer to recipes from YouTube or like some of the cooking blogs. So classes are similar to recipes, okay? They are not actual dishes, but they tell you what are the ingredients, how you need to cook, and all the steps are provided in it. So similarly, the ingredients can be data members, and the recipe, like whatever steps are there, that okay, boil water for 20 minutes, boil pasta in water for 20 minutes, and so on. So all those, you can consider them to be member functions. So it is actually, classes define how you can access that particular object, and you can just think of it being similar to a recipe. I'm not sure if it's a great analogy or not, but hoping that you understand, like whenever a dish is created out of a recipe, objects are created in a similar way out of those classes based on that blueprint. So class is like a blueprint. Okay, now moving on, let's first see the code. Understanding the code is really important. So for this module, I have actually written the codes. We can understand them in detail. So if you see on your screen, I have defined a car class, okay? And it has few of the entities, like model is there for string data type, mileage is there, which is a double, color can be there, and year of registration is there, which is an integer. Now all my class is, okay, first of all, in the access modifiers also, these are the keywords, okay? Public, protected, and private. These are the keywords which you need to use in order to define an entity as either public, protected, or private. And if you don't define anything, it means it's a private entity. So now, like if you look at the code, model, mileage, color, and year of registration, nothing is mentioned on top of them. But if you look at the member function, which is print color, it has a public annotation on the top of it, which means that print color is a public function. And above that, all the other entities, which are the data members, those are private, because by default the access modifier is private in C++ object-oriented programming. So now this means that model, mileage, color, and year of registration cannot be accessed by everyone. It can only be accessed by the member functions of that particular class, which means that if I wanted to access color, I could like call it within a member function, like I have done here in print color. Okay, so this doesn't create a car variable. First of all, this is just the definition, like integer is 8 bytes long, and all of integer is 4 bytes long, and all of those definitions and signatures are provided, right, for a data type. Similarly, car over here is a user defined data type. Now we will understand how objects are created out of these classes in the next part. Now what are objects? So let me just give an analogy from the previous module. Like integer is a data type, and similarly car over here is also a data type. Now when is memory allocated to that particular integer? Whenever we declare it, right? If you remember the difference between declaration, definition, and initialization, whenever we declare it, if this statement is executed int a, it will allocate 4 bytes memory to that particular variable. Similarly, if I use car C1, okay, this is just a variable name. You can use any variable name you want to. So this means that suitable amount of memory will be allocated to car data type to C1 variable. Okay, now what memory should be allocated? It should be necessary for string, which is string model. Now similarly, there is a double for mileage, there is string for color, and there is an integer for year of registration. So for these 4 data types, some memory needs to be allocated. But if you notice both the strings don't have a fixed size at this moment. So there would be some buffer memory allocated to them, and actual memory management is dependent on the compiler over here. So let's take a look at the code, how an object is actually created. So now if you see, I have added some member functions as well, and I have added a data member which is on, which means that the car is on or not. It's a boolean. And I have changed some of them as well. I think there is double speed which is added, like what is the speed of the car at that particular moment. And something which you notice on the screen is like whatever the part is highlighted, it is known as a constructor. So whenever you create an object, you can pass in some variables, some values, so that they can be assigned to the data members of that particular class. So this is the syntax of a constructor. We won't be covering that in detail because constructors and destructors probably goes out of the scope of basics of object-oriented programming. It is a critical part, but we won't be covering that in detail, and without understanding them comprehensively, you are good to go with this particular module. Okay, so what is the syntax of a constructor? That we need to understand. Class name, over here it's car, but like typically it would be a class name, followed by a parenthesis. In this, there can be one or more data types. There can be 0 data types as well if it's an empty constructor. So 0 or more parameters. And it is similar to a function. First of all, if you try to find the analogy with our previous modules, it is similar to a function. And constructor is actually a function. So whenever, for example, whenever we did int a is equal to 5, what actually happened was 4 bytes were allocated in the memory to variable a, and 5 was assigned as the value for that particular memory. So whenever an object is created, the constructor is called. This is a user-defined constructor. There is a default constructor as well, which the compiler uses if we don't define a constructor explicitly. Okay. So over here in the code, we have explicitly mentioned a constructor which should be used whenever we are declaring that particular object. So we can assign the data members, whatever data members are there, to these parameters. It can be param1, param2, and so on. I mean, looking at the code, it will give you more clarity. So we have taken 3 parameters, int m, string c, and string mdl. Mdl stands for model, c stands for color over here, and m stands for mileage if I'm not wrong. Yep. So if you see inside the constructor, what we are doing is we are actually assigning values to the data members of that particular class. Okay. For speed, we are not passing any parameter. So what we are doing is we are assigning it to a default value 0. At that time, because it makes sense. Right now the car would be like, we are just creating the object for car, so its speed would be 0, and is on is also assigned to false because that is also intuitive. For the rest of the attributes like model, mileage, and color, we are assigning the values which we have passed as parameters. And if you notice, I have added a couple of other member functions as well, turn on and turn off. If turn on member function is invoked, then we change the is on data member to true, and vice versa for turn off. Okay, so now this is how car C1 followed by a parenthesis and those parameters that we talked about earlier for mileage, color, and model. This is what we can pass if we want to construct that particular object. So whenever we call this function or a constructor, okay, car C1 followed by parentheses and those 3 parameters that we defined in the constructor earlier, it will create memory in the RAM for that particular object C1 of data type car, and it will assign those values as we have mentioned in the public constructor. Now the constructor needs to be public if you want to invoke it from outside the class. So here in line 35 you can see this is outside the class and this is invoked from int main function. Okay, so the constructor needs to be public. A constructor can be private as well if you want to invoke it from within those member functions itself. And then we are calling c1.printColor, which means that it will call the printColor member function and it should be printing that particular statement. Let's try to compile this code and we can run it as well. Okay, it's compiled, and on running it, it says car's color is white. So if you notice in line 35, we were assigning the color white, like we were passing the color white, and in the constructor, we were assigning it on line 17. And in line number 22, that member function is trying to access that particular color attribute. So if we were to call c1.color, okay, this will be a revision for the access modifiers as well. If we were trying to call c1.color, this should throw an error that color is a private attribute and it cannot be called from outside that particular class. So this should fail in compilation, I'm not sure. Yeah, if you see std string car is the data type, car double colon color is private within this context. Okay, which means that c1.color, you cannot execute that particular statement because c1 is created outside the scope of the class. So this means that we need to provide some function in order to access it, and that function should be public. If, for example, if print color was private as well, we won't be able to call print color c1.print color like we did on line number 36. So I hope at this point, like how you can create objects and how you can define the class, that part is clear. Okay, and we will talk a little bit in detail, like you already know what access modifiers are, but we will just extend it a little bit and understand that in more detail. So now there are three types of access modifiers which we are already aware of: public, protected, and private. So now private entities. When I say entities, I mean both functions and the variables which are defined inside the class. So private entities can only be accessed by entities of that class. When we talk about protected, it's a superset of private. It is accessed by all the entities of the class, plus it can be accessed by entities of child class. Now this will become more clear in inheritance, so no need to worry if you don't understand it right now. Just remembering the definition in some sorts is sufficient at this moment. Now about public, it can be accessed by the entities of that class, plus it can be accessed by entities of the child class, plus, I mean, it's the superset, it can be accessed by anything. Okay, accessed by anyone. So this is the rough definition of access modifiers. And I mean, that was pretty clear in the example that we took over here as well, that we were not able to access the color attribute directly from the main function as it was private. I'm not explaining the protected part over here because there will be a suitable example for that in inheritance as well. Okay, all right. Let me see if there is a specific example for access modifiers. There isn't, because this will become more clear as we take on more concepts of object-oriented programming further in this module. Now, at this moment, it is really important. If you want, you can just rewind this particular video and go through what a class is actually, how crucial are access modifiers in protecting how the data members and the member functions are accessed, and how an object can be defined. Okay. Now let me just tweak the object example to try out some other thing. Can we define a class of data type car with no constructor? Is this possible? Okay, let's try to do that. And let's try to also print the color. Okay. So it says there is no matching function call to car. Okay, so this is the constructor type. If I move back, so this is an explicit constructor that we provided. When you provide an explicit constructor, you need to follow that particular definition. And what we did over here was we defined a constructor with no parameters. Okay, it is expecting a constructor with no parameters for the second example that we tried to do. And it says that there is no such constructor available. but there is a potential candidate which takes in three parameters of type integer, string and string. You can use that, and also adds an expectation that candidate expects 3 arguments and 0 are provided. Okay, so that is the definition which we should be following, but we will come across some examples in future in which we won't provide this constructor explicitly and it will define some object for it. We can tweak it over here as well. Let's say we comment this particular constructor. So now we also comment the C1 part. This should compile. This does compile, but note over here that none of the attributes, none of the data members have been assigned any values. So whatever the strings are, those will be empty strings. So now if you notice, it prints the statement which is there in that particular print color function. It says the car's color is, and there is an empty string over there because we have not defined it. So if you don't define any particular constructor, you can create the object using this particular syntax, like car C1. You don't need to create empty brackets. Like you can create empty brackets as well, but that, like, both of them are equivalent. Okay, so that doesn't make sense. Like lesser code is better code if it is readable. So in this way also, if there is no constructor provided, you can create an object. So I think we observed both the ways of creating an object using a default constructor, which was the second object that we defined, and the first object was using an explicit constructor. Now let's come to the 4 main pillars of object-oriented programming, and we will start with encapsulation. So encapsulation has a very close association with the access modifiers. Okay, first of all, we'll understand what is the technical definition for encapsulation. Access modifiers. Now, what does encapsulation mean? It means that we want to protect the data. We want a particular way of exposing some data members to the public and some we want to hide away from them. So we will use private access modifiers for the data members which we don't want to publicly expose. So if you notice the example that we took for the car class, in that we defined the data members as private because we didn't want them to be accessed from outside. Now, this was not a very good example to show the importance of encapsulation, but imagine there is a bank account data type. Okay, the class is bank account. And let's say there is a data member balance inside it. Okay, and it is public. Int balance. It can be a double, but let's say it's integer. Int balance. Now anyone can access this data member from outside the class, whatever, like whoever the user of this particular class is, and they can update it. Let's say my balance was 10 rupees. And they can tweak it to 100, or they can make it 0 as well, and they can make it negative. There is no control over how this data member can be accessed by others. So this is where encapsulation comes into place. It makes those particular, like whichever data members are critical, it will make them private or protected based on how we want to access it. It will be protected if we want them to be accessed by the child class. It should be private if we don't want them to be accessed by everyone and only by the members or entities of that particular class. So this should become private if we want to protect it, like if we want to hide it from the public. And there will be some public interfaces exposed in the form of member functions. Okay. So it can be like credit, for example. Credit is a suitable operation for which the balance can be increased. Okay, so it can be int amount, and in this way you can update your balance. Okay, and similar function can be created for debit as well, in which we will deduct the particular amount from the balance. But we don't want any ad hoc access of the balance data member by anyone outside the class. So in this way, this is what encapsulation actually means. It tries to control what data member can be accessed by the public and what data member should be hidden from the public, and then it exposes private interfaces for access or any processing on that particular data member. So a typical example for encapsulation would be creating some getters and setters. Now what does a getter do? A getter tries to access. If we want to read that particular, like read the value stored inside that data member, we can use that getter. And if we want the public to be able to set some ad hoc value to that particular data member, we can use a setter. And we can define for what data members we want to create a getter and for what data members we want to create a setter. For example, someone might want to check their own balance. Okay, so creating a getter for them is a very intuitive thing to do in terms of a bank account class. But for example, no one should be able to directly update their balance on their own. So creating a setter for that particular data member is not a wise thing to do. Okay, so we won't expose any such interface to directly update that particular data member. Now let's take a look at the code for encapsulation to understand this in more detail. So if you check the code over here, so we have created a getter and setter. Now this getter and setter is just a technical term, like you can use any name for it. Over here I have used get color and set color because color is a very intuitive thing. Someone wants to get their car repainted with some other color of their choice. That set color option is not damaging to that particular object, and get color is also intuitive, that someone might just want to know the color of their particular car. So we have exposed getter and setter over here. Now we might also want to get speed for something. Okay, but set speed is not a very intuitive function to add over here. Okay, because whenever you are accelerating or deaccelerating, at that moment your speed should change. We should not allow any random access to the speed variable by using a setter. And we have also created some public interfaces to change the is on data member. Like we have provided turn on and turn off if we want to switch on the car and switch off the car. So let's try out the example. What the example does over here is it creates a object C1 of type car, and it's the previous example itself. In line 44, it tries to print the color of the car, and we are doing it in two ways. One is we are using the public interface provided to print color of the car, and other one is we are directly trying to access it using c1.getColor. Remember, we tried to access it using c1.color in the previous example, but it didn't work out because color was a private member. In this case, we have exposed the public interface to provide color. So we still cannot use c1.color, but instead we can use c1.getColor because that is how the creator or author of this class has provided the interfaces for the user to act with them. And in the next line, we are trying to update the color by using a setter, and then we are again printing both the types of colors. Like we are trying to print the same color in two different types, one using the public print color method and one using the get color public getter that we have defined. Now we'll compile it. It works fine. And if you notice, the output is as we are expecting. When we call the setter, it will update the color from white to red. And when we are trying to print the color, it knows that the color has been updated. That effect has been propagated to that particular object, and it is visible from the last two lines that have been printed on the terminal. Okay. So now this is what encapsulation basically is. There is no rocket science. You just try to control what data members you want to give access to the public code, and how you want to give access to it. Some code you don't want setters, some code you don't want getters and setters. It completely depends on your use case. In bank account, I would not mind having a getter for the balance, but having a setter for the balance is quite damaging for that particular object. Moving on to the second concept, it is abstraction. Okay, now what is abstraction? I think I kind of talked about it when we were talking about functions. I talked how the implementation is abstracted when we use functions. So what abstraction means, we want to take away the complexity from the user. Okay, the person who is using that particular object, we want to take away the complexity. So we want to hide implementation and hide complexity. Now, for example, if I'm driving a car, okay, I know that turning on the key will actually turn on the engine, like I need to press the clutch and then turn on the key to start the car. But I actually don't know what goes behind the scene, like how the piston rotates, how the fuel is injected into the engine, how the combustion happens and all of that stuff. Okay, it is abstracted out for me. I just know that I need to press the clutch and turn the key in order to start the car. So that is what abstraction also actually means. It provides a contract to you that this is the name of the function. These are the input parameters which are expected of this particular data type, and you can expect an output of this data type. So that contract is set up for you, and you need to be aware about what the name is, what the input is, and what the expected output is. You don't need to know how the input is processed to give you the output. For example, like in this code, I can add the functionality for refueling, and for that obviously I will need to add some more data members like fuel capacity and whatever the current fuel level is and so on. So we will add two private members, fuel. So we will have something known as fuel capacity as a private data member, and we will also have current fuel level. Okay, we can just write fuel level. And we can define a public function. Now both of these should be private because we don't want anyone to be able to update it or get it directly. We want to encapsulate these data members. And public, we can just have, we don't want any output from this, void refuel. And we can just like mention what amount of fuel we want to add, like in liters. So int added fuel probably. Okay, and we can do whatever the fuel level is plus added fuel, and this will become my new fuel level. So we can just do plus equal to added fuel. Now a catch over here is it can exceed the fuel capacity. So maybe you want to add an if condition on top of it to ensure that whenever we are adding fuel, it doesn't exceed the fuel capacity. And if it does, then we only add, like we don't need to add all the fuel that is provided. We will just add a subset of it. Now, you might be wondering that this looks similar to encapsulation. In that also we're trying to create some functions which were public interfaces to control like how the access was provided to the private entities, and abstraction also looks something similar. In both of them, we don't know what the actual implementation is, but we are having access to that particular member function. But the intention is different. Like both of these are concepts, or both of these are provisions which are important to make a language object-oriented programming. And the intention, what's the intention of abstraction? It's to hide the complexity. It makes life easier for the users of that object. Okay. Abstraction makes life easier for users of object. And what does encapsulation do then? Now, encapsulation makes life easier for the author of the object, because they are in control of what can be accessed by the normal user and what cannot be accessed. So it is encapsulation, you can consider it as a protection feature, a security feature, and abstraction is a feature which makes things easier for the user of that object. So this makes life easier for the author. Now let me just make a distinction over what the user is and what the author is. Author is the person who is creating that class. Okay. So in case of bank account class, whoever is the person who wrote that particular system becomes the author of that class, and it makes life easier for them because they know for sure that they have not created any setter and the balance attribute is private. Okay. They are in a relief that no one can randomly update the balance. Whereas, for example, if I want to do any credit or debit, I am at ease at this moment that I know that my whatever amount I am crediting, it is going to get reflected into the balance somehow. I don't know what is happening behind the scenes, but I as a user am relieved that there are some interfaces for me to debit the money, withdraw the money, to make a fund transfer or anything, and it makes life simpler for me. So the intention is the main difference between abstraction and encapsulation. Now going over some of the crucial concepts now. I mean, encapsulation and abstraction are two crucial concepts, but these are more technically complex as compared to the previous both of them. First of all, let's take a look at the code that we have created so that we don't miss out on any concept. Okay. All right. I think we can make changes to encapsulation to just have a look what is happening. Okay, we can add both, like whatever I mentioned over here, we can add both the attributes fuel capacity and fuel level, and just then we can have a look how we can access it. Now let's expose a public method. Int added fuel, and we want to check first of all if current fuel level plus added fuel is less than or equal to fuel capacity. If yes, then we will add it fuel level plus equal to added fuel. If not, okay, else what will happen? In this case, whatever the added fuel is, if we add that fuel to the current fuel level, it will exceed the fuel capacity. So what we can do is fuel level is equal to fuel capacity, because we know this is going to be greater than the fuel capacity now. So this is how we can just create a function and then anyone can use it from outside. So by default, the fuel level will be 0 and fuel capacity will also be 0. So probably in the constructor, we can have integer fuel capacity and then we can also assign it fuel capacity equals to FC, which is short for fuel capacity. And then in the constructor, we can just change it, like let it be 45 liters. I'm not sure what's the typical fuel capacity. So 45 liters probably. And then we can use, like you can just copy paste the code is visible to you. And you can then try to access the refuel method with the levels of added fuel such that you can like pass 50 as the added fuel, which would probably exceed the fuel capacity. And then when you check the current fuel level, okay, you can just add a getter for this as well, because someone might want to check their fuel level if they want to refuel it or not. Okay, so get fuel is a very valid getter in this case. It's intuitive. We don't need to pass any parameter to it. We just need to return fuel level. Okay. So this example covers both encapsulation as well as abstraction. We don't know how exactly refueling is happening, and the user is not worried about it. They can pass 50, they can pass 60, they can pass 30 as well. And they will be assured that whatever is the actual amount of fuel that should be added will be added to that particular car. So this is how like you can just modify your code and try out abstraction in your systems. Now let's move on to polymorphism, which I was talking about. Now, an English lecture for all of you. I'm not sure if it's an English lecture or Latin lecture, but polymorphism is created out of two words, which is poly, which means many or multiple, and morph means faces, okay, or forms in this case. So polymorphism stands for many forms. Now, if someone were to ask me that, hey, Anshul, define me what polymorphism is in a single line, then this is going to be my definition. A function with the same name, which may or may not have different types of parameters, input parameters, and may or may not have the same type of output parameters, is what is polymorphism. Now, I am sure this definition is not like intuitive to understand, so I will explain it in detail, like what actually polymorphism is. But just to put into words, it is one function name and this can have different input, both numbers and types. Okay, the number of inputs can also be different, like there can be 2 parameters, there can be 1 parameter or 3 parameter. Both number of inputs and data types of input. Now it can also have different output types. Okay, Now there is one data type that we didn't discuss in the first two modules, and now I think that's the right time to talk about it. So if you notice over here, I have been using void data type a lot, but I have not explained it. Okay, so void means empty data type, first of all, which means it's empty. I mean, there is nothing, we are not returning an integer, we are not returning a string or a boolean or anything at all. There is no expected output for that particular function. There is just some processing happening. Either it can be like updating some private data member of that particular class, of that particular object, or it can be printing something as simple as what we are doing over here. We are printing the car's color. Okay, so we don't need to return anything. It just says print color and we are printing the color of the car. So this is an empty data type where we don't expect the function to return anything. So this is what polymorphism basically would mean, but there are multiple type of polymorphisms and definitions would change for each one of them. But at the core, this principle is same. The name of the function is the same, but you can expect same or different input. Okay, but like for example, let's say there is add int comma int, okay, and the return type is an integer. All right. And now if there is another function with the same name and the same input and output types, then this is not polymorphism. This is just confusion. Okay. So polymorphism needs to have something different. It can have a different output type. It can have different number of input types or different input data types as well. So there needs to be something different. There needs to be multiple forms in order for it to actually be a polymorphism concept. And a good example of that would be, for example, there is an add function. Like above you saw an add function which took in 2 integer data types. We can also have 3 integers which can give addition of all the 3 integers and return an integer. All right. And we can also take in 2 strings and then concatenate it. If you remember, there was a plus operator which we were using, right? And for integers, it was performing mathematical addition of both the members. And for strings, it was not doing a mathematical addition. It was doing a concatenation of both the strings. So it was one function, one operator, and it was for different data types. It was doing different things. Okay. Now, I think the core of what polymorphism is clear at this moment. But I want to take some time to explain what compile time polymorphism is and what runtime polymorphism is. Okay, and then there are few other parts of what polymorphism can be. What we discussed over here was compile time polymorphism. Okay, now let me just get rid of this and I will explain what compile time and runtime means over here. So first of all, whenever there is a function definition which defines what the input data types are, what the output data type is, what is the name of the function, and what is the code block inside the function. Okay, that is known as a function definition. Okay, let me just change it to declaration, because for compile time and runtime, declaration is sufficient. We don't need complete definition. So just for a revision, declaration means the output data type, name of the function, followed by the data type of the integers. Okay, this is sufficient for creating a declaration. And then there will be function usage as well. Okay, which means whenever we call that particular function, usage, and this would be something like function name, whatever it is, followed by 5,6. This is just an example. Okay, and we will just have int output is equal to fname 5,6. So this is a function usage and this is a function declaration. So what compile time polymorphism does is, let's say there are 2 different declarations. Let's say this is a void declaration and there is another, let's say this is add. Okay, we will add some function name to it, and there are 3 parameters this time. Okay, so these are two different declarations that we are provided. Now, for example, in the function usage, if I just replace fname with add, and if I have another function usage where I try to add three numbers, 4, 5, and 6, let's say. So this is an example of compile time polymorphism wherein while the compilation happens, the compiler tries to do an early binding of the function call and the function declaration. So it knows that this function call should be mapped to the function declaration on the top, and the second function call should be mapped to the second declaration that we have provided. So at the compilation type, we know that whenever that particular statement is executed, okay, let this be line number 1 and let this be line number 2. So at the time of compilation, we know that whenever line 1 is executed, it should be calling the first function, and whenever line 2 is executed, it should be calling the second function. Now, in runtime polymorphism, the compiler doesn't define which function needs to be called. The decision is taken at the runtime. I'm not covering that in detail at the moment, but we are going to spend some time about runtime polymorphism after I talk about inheritance, because that becomes crucial to understand runtime polymorphism. Okay, so now if I wanted to talk about function overloading, so we already took that example. What function overloading means: same function name, function name, now different, it can have different number of input or different input data types. Or, now these are all ORs, okay. I mean, it can be both of them or it can be any of them, but this is mandatory. Like one of them is mandatory for it to be a function overloading, or it can be different output type. Okay, so now this is the condition for function to be called overloaded, and this happens at the runtime. This happens at the compile time, my bad. This is a compile time polymorphism. Now we have already taken a look at an example of function overloading, which was the add function. So now as we can see that the compilation is successful, we can just try to execute the code, and probably it would take the fourth definition as double, and the output for that should be 3.4. Okay, so it knows what function definition it should be binding to. And for example, instead of 2.4, if it was 2 itself, then it becomes the first function call itself. So there is no meaning of replicating that thing. Now, if you notice, it returns 3, 6, and 3.7. So it does as expected. It tries to call 3 different functions for 3 different types of bindings. Let me just print over here so that we know these are indeed 3 different functions. Add 2 numbers. We can mention add 3 numbers over there. And then here we can mention add 2 doubles or decimal numbers. That would be the right thing to do. Now let's try to call this once again and see what's the output. So if you notice, all the 3 different types of functions are called for all the 3 different types of definitions and function call bindings. So this happens at a compile time. Okay. Now I would try to prove this to you that this happens at a compile time, but then it would mean I had to read the compiled code, which neither you or neither me can read it because it's an assembly level code. But yeah, I think you need to trust me on this, that the function call happens because it has been early binded and it happens at the compilation time. So now this was a typical example of function overloading. Now let's take a look at another type of compile time polymorphism, which is operator overloading. And we have also talked about it in the past when we talked about the addition operator. Okay. Now addition operator, it can take 2 integers and return a mathematical output. Okay. It can also take 2 strings. And in this case, it gives me a concatenation, which is it combines both the string. Now, can you think of an example where we can use this operator overloading? Okay. Now since this is an operator, this is known as operator overloading because it has different definition of functions in a sense, but this is not exactly a function and hence we call it operator overloading. In the previous example, what we were doing was we were having different definitions, like there were different forms of the function and hence we are calling it function overloading. In this, it is different forms of the operator. Okay. So now let's look at the way how we can overload an operator in our class. So let's just open the operator overloading code. Now if you notice, I have defined a class for complex numbers and I have two private attributes, real and imaginary. Like a complex number has two parts to it. And there is a public constructor of it which takes in the real part as well as the imaginary part and assigns real and imaginary to it. Now the syntax of operator overloading. So this is the class name, like whatever data type we want to overload. First of all, it need not be a class name. It is the overloaded data type followed by whatever the symbol of the operator is. Okay, and then we need to take the same data type over here. Let me just get rid of the example. Okay, so then we pass this constant. Now there is const over here. It means that you cannot change the data type which has been passed. Okay. So we are passing the same data type which we want to overload for the plus operator. So for string, it can be something like this: string plus const string and object. I mean this you can name anything. I have just mentioned it object. Okay, and then in the function what you can do is you can just try to perform addition of both the strings, like whatever the attributes are, whatever the characters are, you can add the characters of object to the object of the particular string. Now over here what we are doing is we are using a complex data type. It's not complex by nature, it's the complex numbers. So the definition of operator overloading is like whatever it's highlighted over here. So what we want to do is we want to perform addition of two complex numbers. So we have access to real and imaginary for this particular object, and we take in another complex number in the form of obj variable name. Like another complex number is taken in this particular function through the obj variable name, and then we try to create new real numbers and like new real part and new imaginary part for that particular complex number. And then we return this complex number, which is evident from the return data type of the operator overloading function. Now I am just having a public interface for print complex just to understand what the complex number is. And in the int main function, what we are trying to do, we are trying to create two complex number objects. They have the real and imaginary part 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 respectively. And we are trying to perform an addition. There is no explicit, like we are not using the explicit definition of addition over here. Like in string, there is an explicit definition for string addition, which is concatenation. Here we are using the user defined operator overloading for the plus sign, for the plus operator. And then we'll try to print the complex number C3. Okay. Let's just try to compile this code and run it. So I should be printing the previous complex numbers as well to understand what they were. Let's try to compile this again and run this again. So if you notice, the first two input complex numbers were 1 plus iota 2 and the second complex number was 3 plus iota 4. And the output of the real part 1 plus 3 became 4 and 2 iota plus 4 iota, it became 6 iota. Okay, so this is the addition of complex numbers. This is how you can overload an operator and make it two different things than what it was previously intended to. All right. Similarly, like a take home assignment for you in this case can be to create an operator overloading for the subtraction sign, and you can try to subtract one complex from the other complex number. So this is what operator overloading means. And now before moving to the function overriding part, which is part of, first of all, this is runtime polymorphism, just to give you an hint of it. Runtime polymorphism. And virtual functions is also an example on top of function overriding. Virtual functions, I mean, this is technical jargon at the moment, but I want to cover inheritance before covering the runtime polymorphism. Otherwise, it will become a bouncer for all of us. Now, let's take a look at inheritance first. What does inheritance mean? Okay. Now, this is similar to the inheritance that we have seen in our real lives. Like whenever a baby is born, the people are passing judgments and making comments that, hey, the nose of this baby is looking like his or her father, and like from the maternal side, someone would pass a comment that no, it's not looking like the father, it's looking like the mother, and so on. So in the same way, in the object-oriented programming paradigm also, one class can be inherited from the other class. Let's use the words parent class and child class. So there is a parent class which has some variables, which is the data members, and also has some functions. Now, when this is inherited by a child class, okay, I will show the syntax of inheritance as well. But when we inherit one class from the other class, the attributes of the parent class are passed to the child class, not all of them. I will explain that part as well. If you remember, private attributes are not passed, private functions are not passed to the child class. Only the public and protected ones will be passed, if you remember the definition of the access modifiers. So there will be a subset of the parent class entities which will be passed on to the child class, and the child class can then also add their own data members and member functions. Okay, so the child class will have access to public and protected entities, and they can add their own as well. Like they can add their own data members, they can add their own member functions as well, and they can add of any access modifier, like they can add public, protected, private as they want to. And the definition of public, protected, and private here remains the same. Add their own entities. Now there are different types of inheritance as well. Like we will take a look at the example first before I explain what are the different types of inheritance, and like we will just try and play around with private, public, and protected variables so that we can see that this was indeed the case, whatever I told. Now, like you may interchangeably hear me or anyone using following terms to talk about inheritance. Parent-child is a very common technical terminology for inheritance. Parent-child, superclass and subclass, and base class and derived class. Okay, I may be using any of these following pairs and all of them mean the same thing, that the child class is inherited from the parent, or the subclass is inherited from the superclass, or the derived class is inherited from the base class. So before that, let's take a look at the inheritance code. Okay, so if you notice, we are using vehicle as the parent class, which earlier used to be car, and we are inheriting the car class from the vehicle class. Now there is a constructor for vehicle class and we only have one attribute, which is a private attribute is on. Okay, which means that is on attribute is not passed to the child class, but all the public member functions like turn on, turn off, and boolean is on, all three of them would be passed, as well as the constructor of the vehicle class. So all these member functions will be passed and the child class would have access to them, and the child class can update it. If you notice in the child class car, it has added one more attribute, which is int wheels. It won't have access to the attribute is on directly. Okay. And then in the constructor, we are just initializing it to 4. We are also calling the constructor of the vehicle so that is on is initialized to false. And then we can use get wheels and some of those Like this is the getter for the wheels attribute because wheels is a private entity. Now let's just try to compile this code and see what is actually happening. So if you notice, it has printed 0, 1, I'm not sure what it is, and it says car has 4 wheels. So now let me just add some message so that it is clear. Is on, and I will copy paste this message in the next one as well. And let's just run this code once again. So if you see in the first output is on is false, in the second output is on is true. And if you notice what happened in between them was we used c.turn_on. Now we could not directly update c.is_on equals to true because it is a private entity. We can just comment this statement and try it out. c.is_on is equal to true. Let's try this thing. Now the compiler should throw me an error, and it does. It says that is_on is private within its context. It also suggests me that you can access this particular attribute using is_on function, okay, which we have used in the output statements. But that is not what we want to do. So we can probably convert the private attribute to protected. So if you remember, protected attributes can be accessed by the child class. So now this should compile. So if you notice, it is still throwing me this error. It says that is_on is protected within this context. Now why did it throw this particular error? It is because I'm trying to access the is_on data member from outside the class. I can access it from within the child class, but I still cannot access it publicly. Okay, so I can just add another method to it. Okay, turn child class on. Okay, and this I can use. Now in this case I should have access to this. I should have access to the is_on protected data member because I have put it protected right now. We can also see that if it is changed from protected to private, it will again throw me an error. So let's just, instead of actually updating it from public, we can call c dot, what's the name, turn child class on. Okay, now if we try to compile it, hoping it compiles this time, and it does, and we can see it gives us the same output as it was expected. Now if I convert the protected data member to private, this should throw me an error. I can just remove this as well because by default it is private. Now it says that is_on is private within this context, and we cannot call it in the member function turn child class on. So this will fail, and we can, in this case, we can use the turn on method, which is publicly mentioned in vehicle class and which will be inherited by the child class car as well. So I think this was a good example to understand how access modifiers play a crucial role in inheritance and what is the importance of protected access modifier in this case. Now, as I told you earlier, there are different types of inheritance, and the inheritance that you saw in the code right now, it's a public inheritance, which is demonstrated on line 26. Okay. So the syntax for this is class child. Okay, this is an example. This is not a syntax, class child, followed by a colon, and then whatever the access modifier is for the inheritance modifier. Okay, this is not like, this is the access modifier for inheritance. This is different from the access modifier of the entities of the parent class. Now everything will make sense in a short amount of time. And this will be followed by the parent class and followed by the definition of whatever the child class is. Now, whenever we inherit a parent class publicly, it means that, okay, I think I should make a table as well, but let me remove this first so that I have space to talk about what I want to. So whenever we inherit a parent class publicly, okay, public inheritance, which is what we did in this example in the code. Public inheritance, and by default the inheritance is public. Okay, if we didn't use the word public, it was supposed to be a public inheritance only, contrary to private being the default access modifier for the data members and the member functions. So in case of public inheritance, in the parent class it is public, and in the child class the entities remain public. And this is sort of an identity thing, like protected remains protected in child class as well, and private elements of public private elements of the parent class, we cannot access it. Okay, not accessible, no access. Okay, so in the child class they are followed as it is. The public attributes remain public in the child class as well, and the protected attributes in the parent class remain the protected attributes in the child class. Now if it is a protected inheritance, okay, then in the parent, if it is public, it becomes protected in the child class. If it is a protected attribute in the parent class, it remains a protected attribute in the child class as well. And private attribute, we cannot access it in the child class in any condition. Okay. So now the last one remaining is a private inheritance. In private inheritance, everything becomes private, like whatever, like public or protected attributes in the parent class become private, and we still can't access the private attributes of the parent class. That is the definition. Now we can just take a look at this table so that it makes sense. So this is the inheritance type. And this is the access modifier of parent attributes. Okay, so this is exactly what I told. If it is a public inheritance, then public of parent remains public of child, and protected of parent remains protected of child. Private, we can't have access in any of the types of inheritance. So this is sort of redundant, like we don't need to mention it in the table at all. In case of protected, both public and protected becomes protected attributes, and in case of private inheritance, both of them become private attributes. Now let me just convert this public class to protected. And you will notice that if I try to access get wheels, it will throw me an error that the public over here in line 50, okay, we are trying to access it in publicly, but it will become a protected. Okay, get wheels is overridden, so I think c.turn_on will be protected, so that will be throwing an error. c.getWheels remains public because it is an add-on attribute, add-on function that we have added to this particular car class. If you notice, whatever the functions were in the vehicle class, they will become from public, they will turn protected, and we won't have access to it on line 47. So if we try to compile it, on line 47, it throws me an error that vehicle is not accessible base of car. Okay. This says that is on is mentioned in the vehicle class, and it is inaccessible from this context. But now if I convert this from protected to public, or if I just remove it, the default is public. Okay, I'm assuming default is private in this case as well, so I explicitly need to mention public. All right. Okay, so just to give an update, the default type of inheritance is private, and you can just play around with different types of inheritance type and different types of attributes, different access modifiers of the base class, and you can just try it out what all you can access from which class or from public you can access and what is not accessible. So now I think we have talked sufficient things in inheritance, and it is a good time for us to go back to our remaining runtime polymorphism. So what is function overriding? Now this has a very close relation with inheritance. Let's say we have same function definitions in both child class and the parent class. Okay. Let me just open an example so that understanding it from a good example is better. So if you check the code over here, there is a parent class and there is a child class which publicly inherits the parent class. Both of them have public member functions print, but both of them have different definitions of the classes. I mean, in one of them we are printing parent class, and in the child class, which is inherited from the parent class, we are printing child class itself. So parent class and child class, it has same declaration, but different definitions. Okay. So in this case, the compiler doesn't take a call which function should be called. It is at runtime decided, like the resolution happens at runtime, and this is also known as dynamic binding or late binding. Okay. Dynamic or late binding about what function should actually be called. So if you notice over here, we are creating a child object in line 22, followed by calling the print function in line 23 and explicitly calling the print function of parent class in line 24. So in line 24, this is compile time decoding, like compile time. At the compile time we decide, because it is explicitly mentioned that the print function of parent class needs to be called. But in line 23, this is late binding because there is no explicit mention of what function should be called. And at the runtime, it will be decided that the print function of the child class should be called because of its data type. So let's just compile this thing. And if we run it, if you see, the first output is child class and the second output is parent class. So if you notice, in the beginning, we are trying to print c.print, which is what, like, the statement inside c.print is child class, and the statement inside the print function of the parent class is parent class. So when we are explicitly mentioning that, hey, call the print function from the parent class only, at that time only, it will decide that, okay, the statement, like the function call, should be done from the parent class, from the definition of the parent class. So this is what function overriding is. Like, the declaration is same. If we compare it with overloading, in that the declaration was supposed to be different. Okay. The definition could or could not be same. The definition was not in contention at that time. And function overriding is possible only in inherited classes. So in this case, we would say that the print function in child class is overriding the print function in the parent class. And now we come to a crucial part, which is virtual functions, and by far this is like the most complicated thing that I would be talking about in this particular module. Okay, now abstract classes and pure virtual function and everything is much more complicated than that, but for the scope of C++ basics in object-oriented programming paradigm, we are not going to cover that part. But that will become more clear in another video, which I will be making on a C++ project of low-level design. In that, I will be talking about it. But in this, let's restrict only to the virtual functions. So now, first of all, virtual functions are overridden functions. That is the first definition of it. And the keyword which we use to make okay, let me take it step by step. A virtual function is an overridden function. Okay, and how do we define a function as virtual? In the parent class, we add the keyword virtual in front of the function definition. So let us take an example to understand that, and this is also an example of runtime polymorphism as I previously mentioned. So let's just open the code for virtual functions. And if you notice, like it's a similar kind of a definition. We are having a parent class, child class inherits from the parent class, and it is a public inheritance. Now there are two methods, print and display in the parent class, both of which are overridden in the child class. Both of them have different definitions, but the same declaration, like the input parameters and the output data types, everything is same. But if you notice on line 7, the print function in the parent class is marked as virtual. Okay. So when we override it, there is an explicit message transferred to the compiler that, hey, don't decide the binding at the compile time, it should be done at the runtime. So virtual keyword tells the compiler to do late binding. And runtime polymorphism can be achieved by using the pointer, base class pointer. Okay. Now I will explain this by using the example, but just for the purpose of a definition, runtime polymorphism can be achieved by using the base class pointer. Now a base class pointer can point to both a base class object or a child class object. Okay, and a call is taken at the runtime. If it is a base class pointer, then what function we should be calling based on the content which the pointer is pointing to. Okay, how is it decided? Based on the content pointed by the base class pointer. Which function should be called? The one in the parent class or the one in which is overriding in the child class from the parent class? Which function should be called? Okay, so now this late binding is done. Now if we carefully look at the example, what we have done in the int main function, we are creating a parent pointer with variable name p and a child object which is defined with the variable name c. Now in the next line, what we are doing is p equals to c address of c. Okay. Now what is happening? We are pointing p to the location of the child object c, which means that even though it is a base class pointer, the object which it points to is actually of the child class. Okay. And this is how like we can achieve runtime polymorphism, like by using the reference of the child class. When we point the base class pointer to the reference of the child class, it will lead us, it can help us achieve runtime polymorphism. Okay. Base pointer to reference of child object. Now, this is just a quiz for you. I'm not expecting you to answer it correctly. But when we call p arrow print and display. Now, first of all, whenever we are using pointer, the elements which it points to, we can access them by using a arrow instead of a dot, which we were using for normal objects. Okay. So now p print and p display, what should be happening behind the scenes? Let's first print it and then I will talk about why it actually happened that particular way. Now let me just get rid of this, or we have an empty page. We should be having an empty page. Yeah. So this is not about inheritance. Now the first thing which has been printed is child class, and the second output was parent displayed. Okay, let's also take a look at what were the commands for this. P arrow print and P arrow display. Now just to add some details, print is marked virtual in the parent, which means that it tells the compiler that, hey, don't do early binding of this particular function call. We will decide at the runtime what should actually be called. So when in line 32, if you notice, the content of the base class pointer is actually child object. Okay, so based on that late binding, whenever we call P arrow print, okay, when this call is happening, we will see that P actually contains data of child. So child, the print defined in child class should be called, and hence child class is printed. Okay, now when we are processing p.display, okay, this is an early binding. It says that since the data type of p is of parent, we will actually be using the member function which is defined in the parent class, and hence parent display is used. Okay, parent display is printed. Now that is the reason the first statement is late binding, because we added virtual keyword in front of it and print is marked as a virtual function. And the second function call is early binding. It was decided during compilation only that the display function of the parent class needs to be called based on the data type of the pointer. Now this is how you can use virtual functions to actually invoke or use runtime polymorphism. And we will just take the last example, which is like, I think it summarizes everything that we covered in this particular module. So if you notice, let me just get, I think this is important. This I can get rid of because there is already an image for this at the end of the slides. Okay. So now there is a base class and there is a derived class. Okay. There is a base class and there is a derived class. And both of them don't have any data members. They have member functions present in both of them. Some of them are marked virtual in the parent and some of them are not marked. Okay, so let's talk about base class. There is an F1 function. Corresponding to it, there is an F1 function derived as well, which is overridden, but not virtual. Okay, this is not virtual. I can remove this. All right. Now there is F2 defined in base, which is virtual. And same goes for, now these are empty parameters. Same goes for F3 as well, which is also virtual with no parameters, and same for F4 as well, which is also virtual. Now if I compare it with derived class, F2 is overridden, and if you notice, F2 is virtual in the base class. So if we were to access F2 of the child class using the pointer of the base class, of the derived class using the pointer of the base class, then F2 in the derived class should have been invoked. We will check the output. Okay, so this is overridden. F3 does not exist. So if we were trying to call F3, the one in the base class should have been invoked. And there is F4 with a parameter, int x. Okay, now this is not overridden. We would not call it overridden because it doesn't have the same declaration, not overridden. So now let's just try to run it. What we are doing is we are using a base pointer b. We are pointing it to the object created of derived data type, and then we are trying to invoke all the 4 functions from the base pointer itself. Now I have compiled it. On running it, if you notice the output, let me just type the write the output as well. The output is base 1 derived 2, base 3 and base 4. Now what were the commands used for it? b.f1, b arrow f1, b arrow f2, b arrow f3 and b arrow f4. Now if you notice, like this has a data type of base class, and since it is overridden but not virtual, the decision will be taken based on the data type of the pointer itself, and hence base 1 is printed. Okay, now in the second function call, it is overridden but the parent function is marked as virtual, and since the base pointer points to the object of child class, runtime polymorphism happens, and the decision is taken to call the f2 which is defined in the derived class, because the pointer of the base class points to the object of the derived class. Now it might sound confusing, so you might want to just rewind it and make this really slow, like 0.5 or 0.75, to actually understand what I just spoke right now. And if you notice f3 is not defined in the derived class at all, so we will be calling the f3 which is defined in base class. And for f4, there is like, this is not over, f4 in derived class is not overriding f4 in the base class, so it is not runtime polymorphism. These are two different function definitions, function declarations, and hence since we are calling the one with empty parameters, the decision will be taken that we are calling f4 based on the data type of the pointer. Now I just have another exercise wherein we try to call f4 from the base pointer with an integer input to it. Now this won't compile. This won't compile because it says no matching function for call to base of f4 integer. Now if you explicitly notice, the error says there is no definition for this. Now why does it say this when we are actually having another definition in the derived class with an integer parameter to it? If you notice, this is not overriding. The function definition in the derived class is not overriding, and hence no runtime polymorphism actually happen, because it needs to have a combination of both virtual keyword in front of the base function, and we also need to override it using the same definition of the virtual function in the base class. So hence, since this is not overriding, this will not have runtime polymorphism, and the decision will be taken based on the data type of the base class pointer, which is base object itself, and hence it will not find any function declaration with an integer parameter to it for f4, and hence it throws me that error. But if I had d.f4, this will run, okay, because the data type is different and this gets compiled, which earlier was throwing me an error. And if you notice the output, it says derived 4 because there is a matching definition for it. So in this class, we checked about different combinations of virtual and overriding functions and whether this means runtime polymorphism or not. So I think this was the most difficult piece to understand because there was too much confusing things which I was talking. So try to rewind it, try to run it on slow, and then try to replicate it again and understand why a particular thing is happening. Whether it's a runtime polymorphism or not, check the definition of runtime polymorphism which I said. The function definition in the base class should be marked as virtual, and we should be invoking it from a base class pointer which is pointing to the object of child class. So this is what I actually wanted to cover as a part of object-oriented programming paradigm in C++, and I really hope that you like watch this video multiple times to comprehensively understand what I just said, and then you try to replicate the function that I have written, and then try to do some amazing things with these concepts. So that's it for this particular module. So if you found this content insightful, do give it a thumbs up, like it, and add in the comment section if you have any doubts. And if you want to keep receiving such amazing content, don't forget to subscribe to Scalar's YouTube channel and also hit the bell icon so that you never miss out on the notifications. Thank you. Have a good day.